By the end of this story, you'll understand how to control your response when life doesn't go your way. Have you ever had a day when everything went wrong at once? Someone blamed you for something you didn't do. A plan you worked hard on suddenly failed. And before you could even think, anger took control of you. But what if the biggest problem in your life isn't what happens to you? What if it's how you respond when it happens? Today, I'm going to tell you the story of a man who learned this lesson the hardest way possible. His name was Daniel. Daniel was a hard-working man who lived in a small village surrounded by mountains and farmland. People respected him because he was honest, strong, and always willing to help. But there was one thing everyone feared about him: his temper. Daniel could remain patient for hours, but when something went wrong, his patience disappeared in seconds. And one unexpected morning would teach him that anger can destroy in minutes what patience takes years to build. Every morning, Daniel woke before sunrise. He owned a small farm outside the village. He grew wheat, vegetables, and fruit. His father had left the farm to him many years earlier. Daniel loved that land. It wasn't just his source of income, it was his father's final gift, and Daniel wanted to make it successful. But Daniel had one habit. Whenever something didn't happen according to his plan, he became angry. If the weather changed, he complained. If a worker arrived late, he shouted. If a tool broke, he blamed someone. One morning, his younger helper, Samuel, accidentally dropped a wooden crate filled with fresh vegetables. The vegetables scattered across the ground. Daniel turned around. "What have you done?" Samuel immediately apologized. "I'm sorry, Daniel. My hands slipped." But Daniel was already angry. "You always make mistakes." Samuel looked down. "I'll clean everything." Daniel continued shouting. "You're useless. How many times do I have to tell you to be careful?" The other workers became silent. Samuel quietly picked up the vegetables. Daniel walked away feeling victorious. He had made his anger known, but he didn't notice something. Samuel never returned to work the next day. A few weeks later, Daniel needed to deliver a large shipment of wheat to a merchant in a neighboring town. The merchant had promised a good price. Daniel loaded his cart before sunrise. Everything was ready, but as he reached the mountain road, dark clouds appeared. Rain began falling. Then the wooden wheel of his cart broke. Daniel stared at it. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his anger exploded. "Why does this always happen to me?" He kicked the broken wheel. He shouted at the sky. He blamed the weather. He blamed the carpenter who had made the wheel. He even blamed himself, but none of it fixed the cart. After several hours, the rain stopped. Daniel finally repaired the wheel enough to continue. But by then, the merchant had already left. Daniel had lost the deal. That evening, he returned home exhausted. His wife looked at him and asked, "What happened?" Daniel replied angrily, "Everything went wrong." She looked at him quietly. "No," she said. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the broken cart. "Things went wrong." Then she looked into his eyes. "But you also went wrong with them." Daniel became silent. He didn't like hearing those words, because deep inside, he knew they were true. Several days later, Daniel traveled to the neighboring village to buy seeds. On the way, he saw an old man sitting beneath a tree. The old man was repairing a small wooden box. Daniel stopped to rest. The old man smiled. "You look troubled," Daniel replied. "I'm fine." The old man laughed softly. "People who are fine don't usually look at the ground like they are fighting with it." Daniel almost smiled. "My life has been difficult lately." The old man nodded. "Life has always been difficult." Daniel looked at him. "What do you mean?" The old man pointed toward the road. "Look at that tree." Daniel looked. "It doesn't choose the wind." The old man continued. "It doesn't choose the rain. It doesn't choose the heat. It doesn't choose when someone breaks one of its branches." Daniel listened carefully, but somehow, it continues to grow. Daniel asked, "How?" The old man smiled. "Because it doesn't waste its strength fighting what it cannot control." Those words stayed in Daniel's mind, but he wasn't convinced. "That's easy to say," Daniel replied. "Maybe," said the old man. "Then let me show you something." The old man picked up 2 wooden bowls. He filled both with water. Then he placed a handful of sand into each. He stirred the first bowl violently. The water became completely muddy. Then he placed the second bowl on the ground. He didn't touch it. Daniel watched. Minutes passed. The sand slowly settled. The water became clear again. The old man pointed toward the first bowl. "When you are angry, your mind becomes like this." He pointed toward the second. "When you remain still, clarity returns." Daniel asked, "But what should I do when something terrible happens?" The old man looked directly at him. "Do not make your first reaction your final decision." Daniel remained silent. The old man continued. When something happens, you have two moments. The first moment is what happens. The second moment is what you choose to do about it. Daniel looked confused. The first moment may not belong to you, but the second one does. Daniel thanked the old man and returned home. For several days, nothing unusual happened. Then one afternoon, a storm arrived. Strong winds swept across the village. Daniel rushed outside. His crops were bending under the wind. Then he saw something terrible. A large tree had fallen across part of his field. Several rows of crops were destroyed. Daniel froze. His old anger returned. He clenched his fists. "This isn't fair!" He wanted to shout. He wanted to blame the weather. He wanted to kick the fallen tree. Then he remembered the two bowls. Don't make your first reaction your final decision. Daniel took a deep breath. He looked at the field. The damage was real. The crops were destroyed. Nothing could change that. But shouting wouldn't bring them back. So Daniel picked up an axe. He began cutting the fallen branches. His workers joined him. For hours they worked. By sunset, they had cleared most of the field. Daniel sat beneath the tree, exhausted. One worker approached him. "Daniel? Yes? I've worked here for years." Daniel looked at him. "Today was the first time I saw something strange." "What? You didn't shout?" Daniel smiled. "I almost did." The worker laughed. "So what stopped you?" Daniel looked toward the broken tree. "I realized shouting at the storm wouldn't make the tree stand again." Months passed. Daniel became calmer. Not perfect, but calmer. He still became frustrated. He still faced problems. But now he paused before reacting. Then one morning, something happened that tested him more than anything before. Daniel's oldest son, Michael, was responsible for delivering an important shipment. But Michael made a serious mistake. He took the wrong road. By the time he reached the market, the merchant had already purchased wheat from someone else. Daniel lost almost an entire month's income. When Michael returned home, he was terrified. "I'm sorry, father." Daniel looked at him. The old anger rose inside him. His heart began beating faster. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell his son how careless he had been. But then Daniel remembered his own mistakes. The broken cart, the lost merchant, the storm, the shouting. He took a long breath. Then he said, "Come sit down." Michael looked surprised. Daniel continued, "You made a mistake." Michael nodded. "But you are not your mistake." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "I thought you would hate me." Daniel shook his head. "I have spent years believing that anger makes people better." He looked toward the window, but all it ever did was make people afraid of me. Michael remained silent. Daniel placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "We will fix what we can. And tomorrow, we will try again." Years passed. Daniel became known throughout the region. Not because he was the richest farmer, not because he never failed, but because people noticed something different about him. Problems still came to Daniel, but they no longer controlled him. One winter morning, Daniel received terrible news. His entire harvest had been destroyed by an unexpected frost. It was his biggest loss ever. The villagers waited for Daniel to become angry. They expected shouting. They expected blame. Instead, Daniel walked into his field. He looked at the frozen crops. Then he quietly said, "I cannot change the frost." He paused. "But I can decide what I do next." The villagers stood silently. Daniel turned toward them. "Who has seeds?" Several farmers raised their hands. "Who has tools?" More hands went up. "Then let's begin again." That day, the villagers worked together, and something beautiful happened. Daniel's loss became the beginning of a new community. Farmers who had never helped each other began sharing tools. Those with extra seeds gave them to those who had none. And Daniel finally understood the lesson the old man had tried to teach him. Sometimes the event you hate can reveal the strength you never knew you had. Many years later, Daniel returned to the tree where he had met the old man. He looked around. The old man was gone, but the small wooden box he had been repairing was still there. Daniel picked it up. Inside was a single piece of paper. It contained only one sentence. "You cannot choose the wind, but you can choose how you set your sail." Daniel smiled. He finally understood. Life had never promised him that everything would go according to plan. There would always be storms. People would disappoint him. Plans would fail. Money would be lost. Mistakes would happen. People would misunderstand him. And sometimes, life would simply be unfair. But none of those things had to decide who he became. My friend, you will face difficult days. Someone will hurt you. A plan will fail. Someone may betray your trust. You may lose something you worked hard to build. And your first reaction may be anger. That's human. But remember, Daniel, your first reaction does not have to become your final response. When something goes wrong, pause. Take a breath. Ask yourself, Can I control this? If the answer is yes, take action. If the answer is no, release it. Because anger cannot change yesterday, worry cannot control tomorrow, and shouting cannot repair what has already happened. But your response can change what happens next. The strongest person in the room isn't always the person who shouts the loudest. Sometimes, the strongest person is the one who has every reason to become angry, yet chooses to remain calm. You cannot control everything that happens to you, but you can control what happens inside you. And sometimes, that is the greatest control you will ever have. If this story gave you something to think about, tell me in the comments, what is one thing you are learning to stop controlling? Your answer might help someone else who is struggling with the same thing. Remember, you cannot control the wind, you cannot control the storm, but you can control the way you respond. Protect your peace, control your response, and never let one difficult moment decide the person you become. See you in the next story.